Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I have a live stream coming later with Ada Wadsworth from the charity CARP, and that will hopefully be a really rewarding conversation. So I'll try and keep this extra a little bit shorter than otherwise I might have done. I'm going to start with an excerpt from a book called The Showman, the inside story of the invasion that shook the world and made a leader of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, by Simon Schuster. And Simon Schuster had met Zelenskyy before the invasion as a leader. In fact, before he became leader, as a comedian. And there is a little bit in this initial part of the excerpt that talks about that time. And obviously Zelenskyy being a comedian has put him in good stead for some of the successes he is having in communicating his message as president. But one must not be drawn in by Russian talking points. The idea, as many trolls will say, that he is just a comedian. The guy's got law degree, he's an educated man, and he deserves, as we can see now, to be the leader that Ukraine has. Anyway, it talks about the early invasion and what happened at the beginning, and how he almost possibly delusionally said, after asking in which direction are they attacking us, all of them, he said, beat them back, as if it's as easy as that. But his kind of confidence grew from there. Later that morning, some government officials had already packed their cars and fled. The worst defections affected Ukraine's main intelligence agency, the SBU. Several European leaders offered to help Zelenskyy escape, though he appreciated such invitations. He also found them a bit offensive, as though his allies had written him off. Quote, "I was tired of this," he later said. He tried to steer each conversation back to what Ukraine needed: weapons. And he grew irritated when, in response, he heard more offers to help him flee. "Excuse me," he said, "it's just poor manners." Around noon, his guards received warnings of an aerial strike, and Zelenskyy headed down to the bunker, a facility dating back to the Cold War that looked like a giant subway tunnel retrofitted in the style of an office building. Zelenskyy remembers giving himself a pep talk. Quote, "They're watching," he told himself. "You're a symbol. You need to act the way a head of state must act." Reports began to reach Zelenskyy of a Russian air assault at an airport around 25 miles from the presidential compound. Weeks earlier, William Burns, CIA director, had warned the Russian strategy hinged on the landing of forces there. At the time, Zelenskyy was unconvinced. To him, the Russian plan did not involve enough troops to occupy a city of 4 million. But the CIA turned out to be right. At around 11 a.m., at least 30 Russian attack helicopters swept down. The president's response caught some aides by surprise. They'd never seen him in such a rage. He gave them the harshest possible orders, recalled one. "Show no mercy. Use all available weapons to wipe out every Russian thing there." But the Ukrainians did not have the forces to place to defend the airport, despite the warnings from the CIA and others. Soon the troops ran out of ammunition and had no choice but to withdraw. Meanwhile, an emergency summit of European leaders was taking place to determine what punishment Russia deserved. The leaders of Germany, Austria and Hungary, among others, didn't want to cut ties with the Russian banking system. For a while, their debate went in circles, and Zelenskyy dialed in. Pale and tired, with the early stubble of the wartime beard beginning to show, the president did not have much faith in his allies to save him, and the pessimism showed. Quote, "This may be the last time you see me alive," Zelenskyy told them. Instead of asking to be rescued, he demanded an answer to a question Ukraine had been posing for decades. Would it ever be allowed to join the European Union? His remarks, which lasted only about 5 minutes, had a greater impact than months, if not years, of debates about Russia's threat. Here was the president of a European democracy, holed up in a bunker, preparing to face his death and the subjugation of his country. The nights were hardest for Zelenskyy. His bed was barely wide enough to toss and turn. The buzzing from his phone rarely stopped. Quote, "In those first days, I would wake everybody up," he said. "I didn't have the right to sleep until I knew what strikes had landed where." Then, as early as 4:50 a.m., Zelenskyy would be requesting an update. No one gave in to despair during the early phase, but eventually all of them crashed. There was not much to eat. Sweets got passed around at meetings, and tinned meat with stale bread was in the communal kitchen. One minister told me he survived for days on chocolate. Zelensky's face became sallow. He complained about the lack of sunlight and fresh air. Some of his staff became concerned. His legal aid recalls that he resembled a walking corpse. Quote, "A living person cannot look like that," she said. One morning, the president mumbled, "Good morning." I couldn't even answer. I've never seen a human in that condition. Eventually, life in the bunker settled into a more manageable routine. It goes on to say a bit later, there were also dumbbells and a bench press, and Zelenskyy made a habit of using them, often at night. Later, they put in a ping-pong table. Few could beat him. Occasionally, he invited staff to watch a film, often new Hollywood releases. Zelenskyy could no longer stomach Soviet comedies. Quote, "They revolt me," he said. In a place of the joy and nostalgia they had once evoked, he now felt a void. And talks about his wife sort of going off and living somewhere else to keep her and the family safe. And then the strike on that train station at Kramatorsk, if you remember, it was horrific, all those civilians dying. It horrified him. The puddles of blood on the pavement, the severed limbs among toys and suitcases. In one photo, Zelenskyy saw a woman who had been beheaded by the blast. Quote, "She was wearing bright, memorable clothes," he later told me. That afternoon, he was still struggling to shake the images. When the moment came to meet Ursula von der Leyen, his face was green. At the podium, Zelenskyy's usual gift for oratory failed him. Quote, "It was one of those times when your arms and legs are doing one thing, but your head does not listen," Zelenskyy told me, "because your head is there at that station." "Do I feel hate?" a reporter asked him later that day. "Do you feel hate?" "Yes, I feel hatred for the Russian troops." Yet even then, Zelenskyy did not allow himself to express hatred towards Putin. He even argued that the Russian leader may not be fully aware of all the suffering. Quote, "I'm not sure he knows what is happening," Zelenskyy said. Astonishingly, he seemed to believe that if he could only take Putin on a tour of the war zone, he could let him peer down at the bodies, the war might stop. And it goes on to talk about how he meets troops and eventually, people would stand up to attention to him, a lot more, less relaxed, although that does depend on when and where on the front line. And sometimes there are these relaxed meetings with members of the army and so on and so forth. And then this secret visit to Kherson, if you remember, after the counter-offensive that liberated the city and how the euphoria ripped into a population living there, and he visited Kherson, which was an incredible risk, and a lot of conversation about that, but we're going to join it a little bit later. Since the invasion, he had read about the life of Winston Churchill, the figure to whom he had most often been compared. Quote, "People say different things about him," Zelenskyy noted dryly, making clear he has no admiration for Churchill's record as an imperialist. He would prefer to be associated with George Orwell or Charlie Chaplin, who had lampooned Hitler. Quote, "These artists helped society," he said, "and their influence was often stronger than artillery." For several years, when I would come home from reporting trip to Kyiv, people would ask, "What's Zelenskyy like?" My answers evolved over time, as did his character. On a campaign trail, he struck me as a naive charmer preparing to enter a world of cynics, oligarchs and thugs who took him for an easy mark, and not without reason. But by late 2019, he had burned off a lot of his innocence, but power hadn't hardened him yet. The greatest changes took place in the first months of the Russian invasion. Stubborn, confident, vengeful, impolitic, brave to the point of reckless, and unsparing towards those who stood in his way, he channeled the anger and resilience of his people and expressed it with a purpose to the world. But it was the showmanship he honed over more than 20 years as an actor that made Zelenskyy so effective in fighting this war. In public, his friends and staff had said he always had the qualities to do it well. Privately, they would admit to feeling shocked by his new self. Most Ukrainians did not believe he had it in him. Neither did I. My time with him did not bring into focus every aspect of his character. Some remained indistinct. Others worried me, especially imagining his leadership after the war. I don't know how Zelenskyy will handle that fraught transition, whether he will have the wisdom and restraint to part with other extraordinary powers granted to him under martial law, or whether he will find that power too addictive. The next time I saw him was days before Christmas 2022 in Washington, his first foreign trip since the start of the invasion. The White House sent a US Air Force jet to pick Zelenskyy up, and he appeared in the Oval Office with Joe Biden before delivering a speech in Congress. We saw each other briefly as he rushed through the capital. Maybe somewhere, and most likely around the eyes, the young Zelenskyy from the comedy circuit continued to animate his features, but I couldn't see much trace of him. The easy swing of his body did not survive the invasion. His gait looked leaden, fixed in the shoulders, like a bulldog headed for a fight. The war had not ended, not even close, but the man at the centre of it had finished his transformation into a wartime leader. Some interesting reflections there, and a lot more to in that book, no doubt, to share to boot, but obviously don't have access to that. Would be an interesting read, I am sure. And then we're going to go next to where should we go to next? I might have to leave that long German aid to Ukraine thread about artillery ammunition to a later date. We're going to go into what Mick Ryan has said in way of an analysis of battlefield failure. So battlefield failure can be the harbinger of defeat or the beginning of adaptation and intellectual renewal that leads to victory. This is a challenge that faces Ukraine after President Zelenskyy accepted the 2023 counteroffensive failed to meet its objectives. This was accompanied by the late 2023 paper by Zelenskyy on positional warfare. Unfortunately, too many have equated positional warfare with stalemate. That is unfortunate because they are certainly not the same. What is positional warfare? A 1990 Russie journal article examined the concept as part of a wider exploration of the likely forms of war open to European armies in the wake of the Cold War. Their definition of the application of positional warfare is worth quoting. An army using positional warfare seeks to maintain cohesion by exploiting ground and fortifications to increase fighting power, whilst limiting the opportunities open to the enemy. It strives to use time to permit the mobilization of resources and increase attrition of the enemy. My proposition is that in 2024, Ukraine should embrace positional warfare to deny Russia any major success, bleed them white, and to reconstitute and to prepare Ukraine's physical, intellectual, and moral elements of the fighting power for larger scale offensives in 2025. And that's something I've talked about previously, which is the Ukrainians need to not be advancing, not to deplete their own personnel and resources in trying to attack and regain land. They should sit back and absorb the Russian attempts to do exactly that. And as we can see from what's happened in Avdiivka, in Sinkivka, and other places, when the Russians attack in this way, they end up degrading their own capabilities, their own forces, really quite extensively, to the point of possibly setting themselves up for a Pyrrhic victory, where they might take some land, but they leave themselves much weaker to be sort of counterattacked and lose more than what they gained in that very expensive calculus in gaining that land. So the Ukrainians can look at what's happened over the last few months since the Russians have attacked in Avdiivka and say, hey, we have attrited the Russians in a really tremendous way, both in terms of personnel and equipment, and they have taken minimal ground, and we have soaked up that pressure. And although we have lost, obviously, personnel ourselves, it has been at a preferable ratio. And you look at what's going on in Krinky as well, the same kind of thing. That's what they need to be doing. They need to be doing that for quite a long time, giving them a chance to reconstitute, to recruit more troops, to train those troops, to get more equipment, to hopefully get that funding through from the US, so on and so forth, get the F-16s online, get some longer range munitions in the stockpiles, and all the while using longer range munitions to strike within Crimea, take out the Black Sea Fleet, take out air defense systems, methodically across the occupied regions, so that when it does come to the point where they are ready to attack, the Russians have been fundamentally degraded and depleted. Anyway, on with what Mick Ryan says. This would allow Ukraine to focus on 5 key priorities. Priority 1 is reconstituting the Ukrainian army. Individual and collective training need to be improved in Ukraine and NATO countries so Ukraine can plan and execute offensive operations at scale. The inability to do this was one of the challenges with the 2023 counteroffensive. So there were claims that there weren't enough people trained, and they weren't trained well enough. Even though there was some good training by NATO, it wasn't actually ideal. There was some of the wrong skills were being taught, or they just wasn't as adapted to the front line as it should have been. And I think those issues are being very much addressed at the moment, but certainly needs to be more and more training for the Ukrainians, and that would be a competitive advantage they would have over the Russians. Another priority is rebuilding Ukrainian and Western defense industrial capacity, which is something that's definitely happening a lot at the moment. While artillery production is a significant issue, producing other elements like drones, precision munitions, air defense missiles, and other basic military equipment needs to be stepped up. Third priority is to rethink strategy. The West's strategy of giving Ukraine just enough to defend itself, but not enough to beat Russia, must change. Goodness me, yes. And we're going to come on to that in the last part of this video. It needs to embrace defeating Russia to stop them in Ukraine, stop other Russian adventures, and send a message to Iran and China. But Ukrainian military strategy needs to change, including rethinking military doctrine for modern war. Extant NATO combined arms and air-land doctrine is not fit for purpose. We must undertake an intellectual renewal and develop new doctrine and organizations for battles. Fourth priority is to rethink and reinvigorate strategic influence operations. Part of this is the responsibility of the Ukrainians. They were inspiring in using influence operations as part of defending their nation in 2022. They need to use some of those themes again in 2024. Western nations also need to step up their game. Politicians must better explain to their citizens the purpose of helping Ukraine and why investing in the Ukrainian victory now will ultimately be cheaper and less bloody than just limping along as Western governments are now. This doesn't mean Ukraine needs to be passive in 2024. A fifth priority is strategic strikes in Russia against Russian military operational targets and maritime strikes in the Black Sea as shaping activities for the offensives to come. Clearly, there are political challenges with Ukraine adopting positional war in 2024, but it should not be seen as passive, and it is not an acceptance of an inevitable Russian victory. It is defensive, but only as a temporary strategy while the Russians are attrited, their drone and missile attacks defeated, and the Ukrainians rebuild their strength for a larger and more capable offensive in 2025. As an aside, this is actually something Andrew Perpetua has long been saying, that the Ukrainians should not have had a counteroffensive in 2023 at all. That should just never have happened. They weren't in a position to be able to do so. And that is the Ukrainians kind of know that. I mean, Zelenskyy knew that because he was putting it off. We're not going to do it yet. It's supposed to start in spring, if you remember. But they just hadn't got the equipment yet. They hadn't finished training their soldiers. And indeed, by the time the Ukrainian counteroffensive started, they hadn't received Abrams tanks. They hadn't received ATACMS. They hadn't received really enough of the equipment they really wanted. They hadn't finished training their troops. There were still troops training en masse in Europe that hadn't been brought to bear yet. And so, yeah, I think Andrew was probably right. It shouldn't have happened. They should have had a time of doing what they're doing now, which is fundamentally degrading the Russian equipment and networks and air defenses and so on and so forth, and ridding Crimea of the Black Sea Fleet, doing all of that stuff while sitting on the defensive and soaking up the Russians as they commit maneuver harikiri, which they've done an awful lot of. He continues, you can listen to my full commentary on this issue in his latest War Shorts commentary at Future Doctrina. So he's on Substack and you can go and find him there. But that's really good from Mick Ryan. And what's good as well, I quite often say this because I have a lot of self-doubt in terms of like, I'm no expert. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just some random philosophical dude that has started talking about the war, but actually all of those things are what I've been saying it should be happening over this winter and spring period and possibly going forward even longer. So it's good that there's agreement there. Now, Edward Hunter Christie here talks about he's a senior research fellow with a PhD, Belgium Military Academy as well. So he's a research fellow at this place, FIIA. I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, according to French journalist Elsa Vidal, of course, so this is an interview Elsa Vidal gave. Of course, our governments deliberately starved Ukraine of the most decisive weapons. Types of weapons. This needs to be universal knowledge now, but she goes further into the interpretation, which is interesting. So this is to talk to this idea that the Americans, and I talked about this right at the beginning of the war, because I was like, I did tout this theory, and I was at the time I was like, I think this theory could be what's going on, and then I was like, no, surely it can't be what's happening. And now I'm like, well, the elements of it might be applicable, and some of you guys definitely believe it because you've espoused it, which is that the Americans, for example, and others are only helping Ukraine just enough so that they sort of prevail, but you have a prolonged engagement and conflict whereby the Russians are fundamentally degraded, not just degraded in terms of military, but also you can argue in terms of the economy. In other words, this kind of war that lasts a long time and has these ongoing sanctions that are amplified, ramped up just incrementally each time, will cause a much more fundamental downfall of Russia. So on the one hand, we can argue that Ukraine should have been given more weapons right at the beginning, everything that they needed and more of it, and that would have caused Russia to lose the war relatively quickly. But on the other hand, you can see the value of prolonging this, because Russia are going to be on their knees and they're going to be unable to come back and exist as a nation at the forefront of geopolitics for decades, for a generation. This kind of drip feed into Ukraine is to use Ukraine instrumentally as a tool to fundamentally degrade Russia in a way that can only be achieved by this kind of long-term grinding conflict. And this is what this French journalist is saying. So she believes it's our fear of Russia collapsing following a proper defeat. So there's also that element in it. She also fingers RAND Corporation for being responsible for promoting the cynical policy goal of aiming for neither defeat nor victory in Ukraine. Additionally, and that's also a diagnosis I made on this platform, she notes that aiming for a stalemate to begin with was necessarily going to make sustaining the political will to support Ukraine more difficult. And in my view, it's on the latter point that we really see the problem we have today, with the US losing heart and resolve at the level of the entire country, because the policy was not some kind of golden middle worked out by geniuses, but a costly and bloody and cowardly middle of the road trajectory at a time in history that requires decisiveness. Vidal concludes, the entire governments in the eastern half of Europe, like many parliamentarians across all of our nations, like hundreds of experts on the region and on military affairs, that we must aim for victory. So it's the idea that they weren't aiming for victory, they're aiming for this kind of prolonged conflict. And if you remember back in April of 2022, I think it was, that Lloyd Austin came out and said, we want this war to fundamentally degrade Russia so that they can't do this again. And so he was almost explicitly advocating for a policy towards Ukraine that results not in Ukraine winning and winning as quickly as possible, but a policy that degrades Russia so fundamentally that they can't do it again. And a quick win, I don't think would have done that. A quick win would have maybe got Ukraine back to their 1991 territories or something like that, but then Russia they wouldn't have lost those thousands and thousands of pieces of artillery, those thousands and thousands of pieces of equipment like IFVs and tanks. It would have taken a quick beating, but then could have come back for more at a later date. And so actually I can see the value in both of these approaches. But this kind of long-term approach is really, really frustrating, because you can also say, well, Ukraine could have won and they are being bled dry in terms of their own forces. But I think we've probably reached that point where the Russians have been so fundamentally degraded and their economy is absolutely screwed in a long-term way now that now's actually the time. This could be the optimal kind of outlook. I mean, I'm being cynical here and I'm not thinking about the lives of Ukrainians, right? I'm literally doing this from a really dry, cynical geopolitical stance, right? So remember that. This might not be the most moral positioning from looking at certain angles here. Although you could argue, morally speaking, it's the best because it stops Russia being able to do this going forward again to other places, or taking this further into Eastern Europe. But we might have got to this point where actually that prolonged approach has done what it is going to do, which is degrade Russia massively in terms of equipment and personnel. And now if we gave them, say, 2,000 ATACMS, all the cruise missiles you could poke a hairy stick at, F-16s, Gripens. If we did now load them with the ways where we're setting out to win, right now you're going to win. Everything we're going to do for you now is to enable you to win as quickly as possible. Then you might get to you might get to this golden middle where they're degraded and they're destroyed, and Ukraine prevail and kind of win this thing. So there you go. I think that's interesting thinking by this person, Vidal Moscou. But it's something that you guys talk about quite a lot in the threads. Let me know what you think. I know that there's this impasse in Congress that might not have been predicted, right? And so therefore it's difficult to say that this kind of delay was the intention of the US, but in general, in the way that weaponry has been given to Ukraine. What do you think? Do you think this is a purposeful strategy, or do you think this is a strategy that came predominantly out of being scared of escalation? So rather than degrading over a long period, it's like, we're afraid of this red line, so we're only going to give this much, we'll give this much. Okay, the red line, nothing was done. Okay, well, there's a new red line, we'll give this much. And then that kind of incremental drip feeding came more out of the conservative way that the US government were approaching the war in terms of being afraid of escalation. Or was this always their intention? Let me know. Anyway, that's enough from me today, because there's going to be more content from me later, and I'm going to do a quick frontline update as well. So thank you, take care, speak soon, toodle pips.